And now, live from beautiful and exciting Las Vegas, one of the most influential talk show hosts in America, radio icon Alan Stock.
Anna, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on this Friday morning. We're shifting our Friday round a little bit because my friend Aryeh Green the director of Media Central, was able to come in during this hour, and this hour only. And so I said, you know what? Let's shift things around, and we'll get him in here at 7 o'clock. And he is now joining me, and I appreciate your coming all the way from Israel to be with us.
It's a pleasure, Alan. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you. Media Central is an initiative of honest reporting, providing support services to foreign journalists based in or visiting Israel. And plus, you've been a former advisor to Natan Sharansky, and you've got a long list of being business consultant, high tech, and everything going on. So you do a lot of things. But right now, Director of Media Central keeps you pretty busy, especially trying to lay out, I guess, the differences between what we see in the mainstream media and what really does go on.
That's true.
I want you to comment on a couple of things that are happening. First of all, let's do it this way. On Wednesday, there was a press briefing. U.S. State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki called for restraint on all sides during the search for the 3 kidnapped boys. Restraint on all sides.
Yeah.
And she went on to say, we were encouraged by President Abbas's strong statement to the Arab and Islamic foreign ministers today in Saudi Arabia. But we urge both sides to exercise restraint and avoid the types of steps that could destabilize the situation. So this is after 6 days after they were kidnapped. They finally admitted one was an American. The question came during the press conference, so we can confirm that one of the kidnapped was an American. The question was, which one? She said, well, I believe his name has been reported. I don't have it in front of me. State Department still believes that paying the PA, which then pays Hamas, has no influence in Hamas's decisions. So a question was also put to her, this. But there's numerous Israeli officials have said that the U.S. decision to work with and continue to fund the Palestinian government, the new unity government, contributed to this incident with the 3. Am I correct in thinking that you still would reject such an allegation? She says, yes, That is correct.
Yep.
Your thoughts on that?
Well, the problem is, I think, when we look at how the media has covered this particular last week and the events as they transpired in Israel, and we then noticed the effect of the media coverage on the policymakers, it seems direct. Now, for instance, just as one example, to take the kind of thing that we at Honest Reporting describe as it all started when Israel struck back, meaning Israel's retaliatory activities or actions, whether they're military operations or otherwise, become then the focus of the story. So, for instance, when on Friday night, Saturday morning, Israel arrested approximately 80 members of the terrorist groups Islamic Jihad and Hamas, terrorist groups, by the way, referred to in the media as considered by the United States and Europe as terrorist groups, as if the consideration is something that's up for... No, they are recognized as terrorist groups. In other words, here's the reality, and thankfully, the American and the European government have recognized
those words, you see,
terrorists.
do play a part in how people perceive what's going on.
Well, that's exactly the point I was going to say, is that let's take just one example. You could find it in many American medias too, but I just happen to have at hand Sky News, whereas sometimes perhaps they could be referred to as skewed news,
yes.
as on Honest Reporting's communique from that day. Their headline was, Israeli arrests risk igniting a new conflict. And let's just parse that for a second. What's going to ignite a new conflict? What is the provocation? What is the first cause here? It's not the kidnapping of 3 innocent teenagers who were doing nothing but hitchhiking on a very, very well-traveled road. Yes, it was in the disputed territories, otherwise known as the West Bank, but within the framework of a community, a Jewish community, and a very, as I say, well-traveled road, a place I passed by. It happens to be about 10, 15 kilometers from my home on the other side of the 1949 armistice lines, where I live in Beit Shemesh. But this area in Gush Etzion, which, according to the Israeli consensus and all of the negotiators from Europe and America, will eventually be part of sovereign Israel. And yet these boys standing on a street corner who were kidnapped, innocent civilians and young ones at that, are not the first. That kidnapping is not the first cause. It's not what ignites a new conflict. No, it's when Israel goes and arrests a number of acknowledged members of terrorist groups. That's going to ignite the new conflict.
So transpose that, to this country and think if 3 kids are kidnapped here in the United States and the police go and they have an idea where they might be and they go door to door looking for them, and whether they find them or not, for one of our media to say, the police trying to find these 3 kids and going door to door, and when they go to door to door, they found some bad guys, so they arrested them. This is going to precipitate a riot or a problem here in America. They better stop. Stop doing what? Stop looking for those kids.
That's right. Think of Boston, to use a terrible example. Almost a lockdown, almost a curfew in Boston as we searched, and rightly so, door to door for those who carried out that horrific bombing in Boston. And you didn't hear any American voices who were suggesting that the governor of Massachusetts, the mayor of Boston, or the chief of police were somehow igniting a new conflict with a minority community where it was known that the perpetrators had come from a particular ethnic identity.
I've seen many reports also over the years where rockets are fired from Gaza into near Sderot and other communities in southern Israel, and then Israel responds. So, and the headlines always of the story is Israel, attacks terror base in Gaza. And then you read down, and at the very, very bottom, you say, by the way, this was in retaliation for this,
I wish they would call it a terror base. What you often see is Israel kills 2 Palestinians in Gaza, and as you say, the context is lost. And coming back to your question about the State Department's kind of quote-unquote balance, we can see, for instance, from the New York Times coverage, unfortunately, where there was an extensive piece that was giving great sympathy to the Palestinians who were suffering from this manhunt, as it were, where very, very few have been either inconvenienced or certainly not those arrested or members of terrorist groups. And yet the sympathy for their difficulties to get to work in the morning, a 20-minute delay like being on South Durango here or what have you, and that feeds directly into the State Department or other policymakers saying, hey, everybody's suffering here, both sides.
We'll talk about, mainstream media in general, and that's why talk radio exists the way it does here in this country. We'll go back to with Aryeh Green in a moment. You want to join in, 257 KDWN and 702-257-5396. 721 at Newstalk 720 KDWN. I'm Alan Stock, and I want to thank you so much for joining us on this Friday morning. Great to have you with us. 702-257-KDWN, 702-257-5396. Aryeh Green, Director of Media Central, is joining us, and these are the folks who provide factual reporting, honest issues when you see the mainstream media skew issues. And Aryeh, I'm glad you're here. We face the same thing in this country, no different at all, because the mainstream media, which has been, in the hip pocket of this president, reports on things favorable to him, no matter what. And when things are not going well, they kind of take a look at, let's talk about the price tea in China or something like that. So, talk radio definitely puts it out there, and you're not talk radio like we do. You're not trying to, get people fired up. You just out there going, here are the issues. Let me give you another issue here. And you can comment for yourself. This is the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now, we all know about the Red Cross. It's wonderful that they're there to help people and everything like that. They've called on Israel to resume prisoner visits for Palestinian terrorists. Not a mention of the fact that the Palestinian groups currently hold 3 Israeli teenage hostages. They say that the doctors say that conducting regular visits, their doctors are conducting regular visits to detained hunger strikers, and they call for a swift resumption of family visits. They say the group does not, and the group does not extend the same demand to the kidnappers of the 3 young men, 2 16-year-olds and 1 19-year-old. They note, the group notes that mounting tensions and an extensive military operation, how you said it before, takes place to rescue 3 abducted people in the West Bank. They stop short of demanding the release of the hostages or the right to even visit them. But the family should visit the ones held by Israel, the terrorists, but they won't do that. Now, the Red Cross does detail the military aspects of the current incursion to Palestinian Authority-ruled cities in order to track down the missing boys, and they say this, which is exact. They quote you. Quote must have been from here. The operation currently underway has included house-to-house searches and night raids, over 200 arrests, and the requisition of some private homes, incidents of assault and clashes resulting in casualties, including 1 death in the West Bank and injuries in Gaza, are fueling frustration and may trigger further violence. In Gaza, renewed airstrikes and rocket fire are also contributing to rising tension. By the way, the 1 death in the West Bank was because the guy pulled a gun on the IDF and they shot him back. And the injuries in the Gaza were a result of the planes responding to the rockets being fired from Gaza. Let's put this in context.
And yet, the Red Cross uses the term trigger, which is exactly what we're talking about. Do you know, Alan? You don't know this, and you didn't know this. We didn't discuss this beforehand when I came in this morning. But I was actually a medic in a combat unit in the IDF. I did 17 or 18 years of once a year, 30, 35, 40 days a year of reserve duty. And as a medic in a combat unit, I served, if I recall correctly, 3 or 4 times in different IDF field hospitals, which treated and twice actually in prison compounds where Palestinian detainees and prisoners were held, and I served in the compound's medical unit, including during the operation that we called Defensive Shield in 2004. I can tell you from first-hand experience, which included actually discussions and accompanying representatives of the Red Cross into these areas, that there is no military operation or country, democratic or otherwise, on the face of the earth which provides more either humane treatment, medical treatment, or other kinds of services and privileges to detainees, arrestees, or convicted criminals, terrorists, murderers, what have you, than the IDF and then the government of Israel does. And I'm not saying this as some rah-rah Israel representative. I'm saying this as somebody who has been there, who has seen this, and who knows exactly what happens on the ground. I remember we had an argument once in this operation called Defensive Shield in 2004, where a terrorist who had blown up his hand putting together a improvised explosive device was brought into us, and one of our medics refused to treat him. And our doctor and a few of us, the rest of the medics, treated him. We had a long discussion that night, going into the night, as to the ethics and the responsibility that you have as a medical professional. I remember part of that discussion had to do with the fact that Israel pays for all sorts of medications, treatments, back physiotherapy for back ailments, and what have you, to the Palestinian prisoners who are under our care. Now, I'm not suggesting that there aren't occasional abuses, as there are in America, as there are across Europe, in any society which is a large society where there are individuals who may abuse their authority. But let's get real here. If Israel arrested 200, and only 200, Israel didn't arrest 2,000 or 20,000, which would have been also reasonable in terms of making a sweep through densely populated territories where there is a relatively hostile population and, more importantly, hostile leadership. And I hold the leadership of the Palestinian society responsible for the animosity and the violent rejection of Israel's either right to exist, let alone right to defend itself, which leads to the kind of activities that we're seeing now, like the kidnappings.
Let me substantiate something you said, because it's very, very important that everyone understands that when you said that Israel treats them humanely and they treat them better than any other people treat them, people might say, well, really, is that the case? I know for a fact, and I've talked about this many times on the air, that in the Syrian civil war, children are badly injured, sometimes also missing limbs, sometimes life-threatening injuries. and they can't get treated in Syria. They go, the parents secretly take them because the northern part of Israel is right abuts Syria. They take them into Israel, and they're treated at one particular hospital. I don't know the name of it.
That's Hospital Ziv in Sfat, in the holy city of Safed, and I can tell you that at Media Central, we have taken a number of groups of journalists under the radar to visit the Syrian civilians who wake up in a hospital, and they have spoken incredibly emotionally of their fear when they wake up and are told they're in Israel and they think they're going to be eaten alive. And over the course of the days and weeks of treatment, they, and often if they're children, their parents who have been brought in surreptitiously, they develop and they articulate an incredible appreciation, not just for the multicultural and democratic nature of Israel, but of course the gratitude they have for the treatment at no cost, meaning at the cost of the Israeli government. You're absolutely correct. And this is something that Media Central exists for, to help to open the eyes of the journalists to that kind of reality on the ground.
And these families cannot go back to Syria. A lot of them can't go back. They certainly cannot go back and say we were treated in Israel, because the stuff would hit the fan big time. Aryeh Green joining me in studio. He is the director of Media Central. By the way, tomorrow at 6:30, if you would like to meet him in person, a great guy. He's going to be at Young Israel Aish at Sahara and Fort Apache, 6:30 tomorrow night, speaking to the congregation there. It's after the services. You can go on and meet him and shake his hand. But we've got a lot more going on. You want to join it in? 702-257-KDWN, 702-257-5396. I'll continue more with Aryeh Green in just a few moments. I'm Alan Stock, and this is Newstalk 720, KDWN, KDWN. .737 at Newstalk 720, KDWN. I'm Alan Stock, and I want to thank you so much for joining us on this Friday morning. Coming up at 9 o'clock, it's the KDWN Credit Show with Harry Jacobs. 10 o'clock, Boomer's Brain Trust. Noon, Phil's Gang. 1 o'clock, Live Las Vegas with Tammy Grable and Dave Carney. 2 o'clock, Pawn Talk Live with Michael Mack and Chad Forreston. Of course, 3 o'clock, it is the great Jerry Doyle, live right here on Newstalk 720, KDWN. Aryeh Green is the director of Media Central. It's one of the most important organizations in Israel, in my opinion, because they provide information and facts to foreign journalists based in or visiting Israel. So when you pick up and you see Sky News, you see what goes on in the New York Times, and you see what goes on even sometimes in the AP. All that stuff. All of a sudden, you start understanding that what you're reading is got a huge bias to it, a huge bias to it. And I appreciate your being here. The one thing I did want to mention to follow up on briefly. We talked about how the Red Cross talked about what's going on in the West Bank right now and all the arrests, and they don't mention the 3 kidnapped boys at all. But I just have to follow up on this, because their stance was the same that they maintained during the Gilad Shalit affair. Red Cross officials never demanded the right to visit him, the hostage, sufficing only with several polite requests, for signs of life from Shalit.
So what's fascinating about that, and Alan, we're not sociologists, and yet we can observe the incredible double standard, I would say almost racist approach of all Western organizations, or many Western organizations, governments, and the media towards the Arab and Muslim world, in that we demand standards of Israel or America in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Britain, or what have you, which we don't demand of the Arab or Muslim world. It's almost axiomatic that, well, the Arabs and the Muslims, I'm quoting obviously the others, I don't believe this, that the Arabs or the Muslims are going to kidnap young men and hold them for ransom, or, God forbid, worse, right? We know we can demand of democratic, free, liberal Israel as we can from democratic, free, liberal America standards of behavior that include visitations and or even voting rights or economic material benefits.
Why does the media
prisoners.
give a pass? Why do you think the mainstream media in America, throughout the world, Sky News, whatever it is, why do you think the mainstream media gives a pass to Muslims in general? Not only the radical Islamic people who behead people, but in general, we, meaning the mainstream media, usually gives this kind of a pass. We don't in talk radio. You don't. But why do you think that's the case?
Do you know, that's the problem. I do have a degree in psychology, but I don't.
So do I, and I don't understand it either.
I don't understand where some of the, literally, we're talking about looking the other way. We're not talking about ignorance. Let me give you another example. The day after the kidnappings, last Friday morning, a week ago today, in the Palestinian territories, and particularly in Gaza, there were people on the streets passing out candy. Now, this is what happened on the day of 9/11. The mainstream media, the New York Times, CNN, BBC, National Public Radio, what have you, have not given any attention, as they did not back in 9/11, to the fact that there's a society which is celebrating these acts of wanton murder. And yes, I am making a comparison of any kind of society which encourages, and that's one of our biggest frustrations, I think, is that the incitement in Palestinian or in the wider Arab or Muslim world, the leaders in their pronouncements, in their celebrations of murderous terrorists as heroes of national identity of the Palestinian people, or whether it's Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, or what have you. And yes, I'm holding the leaders accountable, not the people themselves who are at the base. Good people want to get on with their lives, but the leadership, unfortunately, of Palestinian society, and here I equate Fatah, the quote-unquote more moderate, and the more extreme Hamas, as well as obviously Iran, Saudi Arabia, and others, of Palestinian, the wider Arab and Muslim world. The leadership inculcates a culture of hatred in their society. And why do we give that a pass? Why doesn't the New York Times cover the rampant incitement in the Palestinian or the wider Arab or Muslim world's education system, media, political pronouncements, culture events, sports stadiums named after murderous terrorists? I don't have an answer for you. The one thing I would say is there is an ease, a comfort level, where we recognize in the West that we might be able to actually do something if we pressure the American or the British or the Israeli democratic governments to try and hold up our standards of ethical behavior. We know somehow deep down that there's no point in demanding of Syria that they stop killing their 130,000 citizens. We know there's no point in demanding of Hamas that they require or agree to visitations of these 3 kidnapped boys or Gilad Shalit before.
But there's
that.
a word for this. You know what the word is? The word is appeasement. And I've talked about this a lot over the last week, because when I think of appeasement, that word, what I think about is the picture that I've seen so many times. I should put this up on my website, of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain with his foot on a stoop, reaching up to shake hands with a smiling Adolf Hitler, and 2 of Hitler's goons on either side of Hitler with their arms folded and a very stern look on their face. That was the meeting on September 24th, 1938, where Hitler demanded annexation of Czech border areas without delay. Appeasement. This is what you're talking about. This is what I think of. Appeasing these murderers, Hamas and these Al-Qaeda and all these other people, ISIS or ISIS, whatever it is the same as appeasing Adolf Hitler. And by the way, you mentioned Fatah. Fatah is the party that Mahmoud Abbas supposedly heads. As supporters of Israel and as supporters of Israel and human rights around the world used social media to campaign for the return of the 3 Israeli boys who were kidnapped last week. This is dated June 15th. Fatah, the party that leads the Palestinian Authority, celebrated the kidnapping with hateful cartoons on its Facebook page. You can't make this up. You cannot make this up.
This is one of the issues that I discuss and repeatedly with the leading members of the world's press who are based in or visiting Israel in our work at Media Central is, for instance, the use of the word moderate before any time you read or hear or listen or watch the description of the president of the Palestinian Authority. It's always preceded by the adjective moderate, as is, by the way, the moderate king of Saudi Arabia.
Correct.
Now, I understand, and you're a member of the media, and you well understand, there has to be some sort of a shorthand. There needs to be some way of distinguishing between the real extremists in Hamas or Iran and the relatively less extreme brand of Arab or Muslim leaders like Abbas or the King of Saudi Arabia. But let's ask ourselves, English language has meaning. And if the word moderate means conciliatory and cooperative and interested in peace and tolerance and harmony between people, and that's what we consider moderation, how can we apply such a term to the president of an authority which routinely arrests journalists for criticizing their leaders, which routinely allows men to kill their daughters or their sisters in what's called honor killings, which routinely incites hatred and violence against the West, America, Christians, Jews, Israel, and what have you. And the same can be said for the King of Saudi Arabia. And we have to demand more accuracy among the media in words like that, calling somebody like the head of Fatah a quote-unquote moderate.
We'll come back and talk about more with Aryeh Green in just a moment. And a good morning, 7:50 at Newstalk, 720 KDWN. And I want to thank you so much for joining us. So Kathy will not be in with the pet pick of the week this week because she had something she had to attend to. So, but I do want you to check out the pet pick anyway, and you can find the pet pick of the week at KDWN.com, the Alan Stock page, or you can go on over to alanstock.com, the very front right there. You can check it out. Either way, it's the pet pick of the week, and I'll tell you about it in just a moment. Right now, Aryeh Green's in here with Media Central, and he thought he was going to be the opening act for a dog today, and but if not so, you're going to stay a little bit longer anyway. We got a lot to talk about. What do you know right now about the fate of the 3 boys who were kidnapped? And I know a lot of efforts being made to find them, but how close are they? Do you have anything that you can report to us?
Well, the truth is, Alan, unfortunately, I really don't have news to share, partially because whatever developments have been occurring, of course, until they're resolved, are kept under wraps, and rightfully so. But Media Central actually took a tour yesterday of about 30 leading journalists to Hebron, to the Shavei Hebron Yeshiva, the Institute of Learning and Study for Jewish students in Hebron.
People who don't know, Hebron is Hebron.
Hebron, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. But
the holy city of Hebron, where Abraham and Jacob and Isaac are buried
with their spouses.
Leah, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and which is a holy city, the second holiest city to Judaism, with the Jewish community there, which is small but vibrant. This group of, as I say, over 30 leading journalists met with representatives and residents of the Jewish community there, and heard from them about the personal side of their suffering and their fears, which was actually a very, very important balance, as it were, and counterpoint to what we were talking about earlier about the New York Times and other media outlets that are so sympathetic to the Palestinian suffering from the few hundred arrests that took place. But they also had a briefing from the IDF spokesperson, Peter Lerner, who was very helpful in helping them to understand what we were discussing before, going into the detail of what this operation to find these boys was all about. Help these journalists to understand this is not a military operation in the classic sense. This is a search and rescue operation.
It's a police operation,
and
basically.
More than that, it's a search and rescue operation looking for these boys, with every effort made, and the details were shared with the journalists of the humane approaches. When the Red Cross, as you were quoting before, talks about requisition of houses, I've done that, been there, done that. I know that when the IDF comes in and says, I'm sorry, we have to use your house as a lookout point because it has a strategic overlook of a particular junction in the street or what have you, we bring food and provide services for the family. We ask the family to stay in one room, but of course we provide for their needs. We're very careful, and I say we, I'm talking about the Israeli society and the IDF as its representative, with whatever occasional misjudgments or infractions occur, which are then prosecuted, of course, investigated and prosecuted. But we're very careful about their furniture. We're very careful about cleaning up after ourselves. it's a phenomenal thing that's what the Red Cross picked up on. But that briefing that Peter Lerner, the spokesperson for the IDF, for the Israel Defense Forces, gave to these journalists helped them to understand what kind of an operation this is and what were the steps that we're taking. And as you said, the steps are extensive, and we can't really report on many of them because at this point, until the situation is resolved, many of those steps are, of course.
So the boys have not been found yet.
Not at all, no. And there's some understanding. As the Prime Minister spoke of a few days ago, that Hamas, as an organization, not individuals, rogue individuals taking action on their own, but that Hamas as an organization has responsibility for this terrible abduction.
But but what people are going to say to you, and I think this is a legitimate criticism. I really do. We had a situation here in America recently where the president released 5 known terrorists from Gitmo to bring a deserter back to this country because we don't leave anybody behind, that kind of a thing. And the criticism was that you're releasing 5 terrorists, and who by the way, 3 of the 5 have now already said they're going to go back and join the fight to kill Americans. And Hillary Clinton, by the way, said they're not a threat to the United States, only to Pakistan and Afghanistan. Oh, thank you very much. That's so sweet, Hillary. Right. All right, but I reminded people that Israel has been doing this for years. It bothers me. We'll get back one Israeli soldier in the body of another and give them 100 terrorists, 200 terrorists.
4,000.
All right, thousands even.
The Gibril exchange was 4,000.
That's insane.
So
Aryeh, that's insane.
You're right, Alan. You're right. And we can have, and of course, criticism of Israeli policy from the right or from the left is 100% legitimate. And the fact is that there are many people who feel that the issue of undermining our system of justice in Israel, where murderers of innocent civilians, who we call terrorists, are actually have their day in court, military court or civilian court, it doesn't matter, and are sentenced to life sentences, are then released, and those who are not murderers also, but who carry out tremendous acts of violence, who are sentenced to 15, 20 years, are released. Many people criticize, without question, just as you are, the calculation made here. But let's understand 2 things. Number one, criticism of Israeli or American policy is 100% legitimate. You know that. You live for that. That's what talk radio is all about, criticizing government policy. And yet, if we understand the foundations of the calculations here, we're talking about a societal value system shared by Israel and America that says we are going to put the lives of individuals as our first priority. Now, you can argue with whether or not this policy makes sense in terms of, and by the way, no less than Bibi Netanyahu in his book a number of years ago, decried the issue of prisoner releases for exactly the reason you just quoted in terms of the American release now, that prisoners, the recidivism of terrorists to go back to their former ways, irrespective of what other pledges they might sign.
But it also encourages more kidnappings because right after the 5 are released, as soon as they were released, the people in Afghanistan, the terrorists that released the Bergdahl, they came out and they said, you know what, this is great. This encourages everybody, not just us, but all of the people around us to kidnap any major Americans you can so we can use them as hostages to get the rest out of Gitmo.
The Israeli intelligence leadership for a decade has said, and very publicly, exactly that there's no question that one of the prices paid for these kind of exchanges, and I don't call them prisoner exchanges. These are not prisoners. These are abductees who were kidnapped versus convicted
but it's a swap either way.
Terrorists or what have you. But these swaps, there's no question the Intelligence Committee has agreed and publicly that it encourages further kidnapping. And that is, therefore, you are correct, a legitimate criticism, but let's recognize
the Jewish
this.
word for that is mishugah.
Well, there is a Jewish value that goes back to the time of the Bible in terms of the issue of the human dignity and the importance of individual life that's referred to in the Talmud. He who saves a single life, it's as if he saved an entire world. And I may disagree with my government's policies, and this is a government policy that has continued for the last 2 decades, left and right in Israel. And I, too, disagree with the policy, but I am immensely proud as an Israeli citizen and a Jew that the governments of Israel, left-wing and right-wing, base their policies like these on Jewish values of holding up the primacy of life, even at tremendous cost.
Aryeh Green is with me. He's going to stay for a little while longer. Director of Media Central. Also tomorrow at 6:30. Tomorrow at 6:30, he's going to be speaking at Young Israel.
6:30 p.m.
6:30 p.m. Yes, he's going to be speaking at the Young Israel Aish of Las Vegas over at Sahara and Fort Apache. So go on out and you can hear him. Costs nothing at all. Great guy. But we're going to continue for a little while at least, right after we check in with news, traffic, and weather. The pet pick of the week you can see online today because Kathy could not make it in. So we'll get back to Aryeh Green in just a few moments right here at Newstalk 720 KDWN. KDWN.
And now, live from beautiful and exciting Las Vegas, one of the most influential talk show hosts in America, radio icon Alan Stock.
And a good morning. Great to have you with us on this Friday morning. Before I do anything, I want to remind you that it's the big Defend Freedom Summer Tour late this afternoon. Concerned Veterans for America putting this on for free. It's at the Silverton Casino from 6 to 8 this evening. Silverton 6 to 8 free. Free event. Great music by Madison Rising. Complimentary catering. There'll be food out there. And the Silverton Casino is going to be catering it. Thanks to them. Concerned Veterans for America, as I've said before, is to veterans what the NRA is to gun owners. They are the ones who actually get out and get that legislation passed and make the issues known for veterans in America. Other organizations are great. Concerned Veterans for America, very, very very active in this area. So please plan to join us. Sergeant Dakota Meyer, Captain Sean Parnell, Karen Vaughn, and Peter Hegseth, who's CEO of Concerned Veterans for America and a Fox News contributor, will be out there. It starts at 6 o'clock, and I'm honored to be the MC of this. So please plan to join us. Get there a little bit early. 6 to 8, Concerned Veterans for America, Defend a Freedom Summer Tour, Silverton Casino tonight. Please plan to be there. I wouldn't miss it for anything. Joining me in studio right now is Aryeh Green, Director of Media Central, and Aryeh will also be at Young Israel Aish. Rabbi Yitzwine is the rabbi there, and he does the show on Sundays here at 9 o'clock on KDWN. They're located over at Sahara and Fort Apache, so it's at 6:30 tomorrow night, 6:30 p.m. Aryeh Green will be speaking, and I guarantee there'll be a lot of people out there. So, Aryeh, thanks for coming in and staying for a few extra minutes. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. I appreciate you having me.
So I know, real quickly, I know you had something. We only got about 4 minutes, so go ahead and whatever you want.
I mentioned to you at the break, Alan, that I think one of the foundations of the challenges that Israel is facing, both in the media and in the political realm and elsewhere, is the following. There are people, many, and thank God most Americans support Israel's right to exist and its right to defend itself consistently over the years, which is why we have such strong congressional support of the strategic alliance between Israel and America, the values that we share and what have you. But too few people remember that Judaism is not a religion, which is a radical statement. Judaism is not just a religion. It's perhaps the slightly less
just a religion.
Radical way of putting it. Judaism is a civilization, according to many sociologists and cultural anthropologists. Judaism is a way of life, a culture. It includes language and a connection to the land of Israel for 3,500 years. Jews were a family. Abraham as our father, patriarch, which became a tribe, which became a clan, which became a nation. And Zionism, which is a modern political movement, the self-determination, as it were, of the Jewish people. Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And this issue of Jewish peoplehood, the fact that Jews were a people, a nation, a grouping, was understood until about 100 years ago. The reason that the majority of the international community acknowledged, accepted, and even championed the idea of a resurgent return of the Jews to the land of Israel was they understood. Look, unfortunately, that was the basis perhaps for much anti-Semitism. Those Jews, they're different. But it was also the basis of an understanding of why the national liberation movement for the Jewish people, called Zionism, was legitimate. And the founding of the State of Israel was therefore based on this understanding that just as the Greeks have Greece, and the French have France, that the Jews deserve a state. Now, perhaps if we had called the country, and there was a public discussion about this, and David Ben-Gurion decided to call it Israel instead of Judea, but Judea was one of the other names that was considered at the time. If it had been called Judea, then this disconnect, this misunderstanding, as it were, wouldn't exist, because, of course, Jews naturally would live in Judea, both as a territory and as a place and as a modern state. And that disconnect is something I think that informs a lot of the misunderstanding and to a certain extent some of the hostility, even among those who ostensibly support Israel's right to exist. This is a conversation I have as the head of Media Central with many members of the media who are based in or visiting Israel. The misunderstanding is that, well, look, if you're a democracy, how can you give precedence to one religion over another? That's anathema to all of us, whether you're president of the United States or the head of the EU or a journalist or the head of the Presbyterian Church or what have you. Us, as Democrats, Americans and Europeans, we don't understand and don't support the idea that you can give priority to one religion over another in a democratic society. And therefore, we're acutely uncomfortable. Many are acutely uncomfortable, even in the Jewish community, of this idea of Israel as a Jewish state. And that comes back to this misunderstanding that as if being a Jewish state has anything to do with religion. Of course, that's one of the confounding issues, that we are unique as a people with a religious understanding. You can be a Christian almost anywhere with any national identity, but that is one of the biggest efforts we have to focus on now in the coming decade, is re-legitimizing Israel's existence as the nation state of the Jewish people.
The Jewish people in the Torah are also defined as Israel. Israel is the nation of the Jews.
The people of Israel, the children of Israel,
right, exactly.
the land of Israel.
So that
right.
makes sense that it's called
the
Israel.
Modern state of
Aryeh
Israel.
Green, if people want to find out more about Media Central, how can they do it?
Come to our website, www.m-central.org.
Okay, and tomorrow night, 6:30, he will be appearing at 6:30 tomorrow night at Young Israel Aish of Las Vegas over at Sahara and Fort Apache. Costs nothing at all, but you'll get the chance to be able to meet him and hear him speak. And fascinating guy, filled with information, truthful information, factual information that you're not going to get through the mainstream media. You'll get it at Fox, you'll get it at talk radio. Not a lot of other places besides Media Central. Aryeh, thank you for coming in. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Alan.
And we
Shabbat shalom to you and to all your
Shabbat shalom
listeners.
to you, too.